So just a couple of quick reminders, housekeeping items. Our friends that are joining us online and on the telephone, please keep your phones and mics muted unless you're asking a question. And of course, questions are welcome. If you're on Blue Jeans and you have technical issues, use the chat feature and get some help to you. All the previous presentations for the Innovative Discovery Series is available online at the DE-CTR ACCEL website. And you must sign in to receive CME credits. You can receive credit online, but you use the Blue Jean chat function and contact Sarah Faye, please, at the start of the presentation. And don't forget that next week we have a presentation on disparities in obesity among U.S. adolescents with disabilities by Dr. Mina Pappas of the University of Delaware. And that's followed by an observational study design overview by our own Payne. Full summer schedule is available, so grab a copy and mark your calendars. So as we get started here, a thread that is woven into the fabric that our presenter today continues to weave is Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and that thesis states, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Dr. Yasser Payne is an associate professor in the Department of Black American Studies at the University of Delaware. He completed his doctoral work at the Graduate Center in the City University of New York, where he was trained in social personality psychology. Dr. Payne also completed a postdoctoral fellowship funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, where he worked on a reentry and intervention-based research project in New York City's largest jail, Rikers Island, for those that don't know. Here in Delaware, he's organized the Street Ethnographic Research Program centered on exploring the notions of resiliency among Black and Brown America, particularly in the city of Wilmington, using unconventional methodological framework. Some of us might know that as participatory action research. Participatory action research, or PAR, is based on the principle that using researchers from within a given community to gather data will result in a much more clear and honest portrayal of not just the study participants, but as well as the information gathered and the ability to translate that into evidence-based practice and policy. So, my pleasure. Please welcome a friend and colleague, Dr. Yasser Payne.
Thank you, Brian. Cool. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Again, my name is Dr. Payne. Yasser, it's always cool of me to call me that. But nonetheless, yes, I'm at the University of Delaware, but the way I like to kind of identify myself professionally more so is, keep in mind, I identify as an African-centered social psychologist. Also, I'm a street ethnographer, very interested in psychology, particularly of those who are involved in the streets and or criminal justice system. So what do they think? What is their worldview? What is their value system? More importantly, how can we use their perspective, their ideas, to inform theory, methodology, data analysis, and social activism. And that's often the part of the work. There's lots and lots of projects done on this population, but that's often the part of the work, their perspective, that I think is most absent. Most absence just from the analysis in particular. I think as professionals we need to work much harder incorporating that necessary perspective, so we can all achieve the change that we want to see, including the men and women who may be in the streets of Black and Brown America. People's Report is my project here in Delaware. I'm actually working on another project right now in Harlem called the Streets of Harlem. That's been taking up a lot of my time. But in any event, this is what we've been doing here and what we seek to build on in and out of the city of Wilmington throughout the state of Delaware. This is the PAR team, or the PAR family, street PAR family. 15 folk, 12 men, 3 women between the ages of 20 to 48 at the start of the project. And Darrell Chambers is what he's one of the 15, but he's the senior research associate. They're all research associates in terms of their titles. He's the guy that really helped to really organize this group in a cohesive way on the ground so that we can all do meaningful and useful work. All right, let's get started. This is also their picture of the Wilmington Street PAR family. This is just the name of the grant, Safe Communities Training and Employment Project. We received that grant through a state block grant, which was given as a function of the stimulus package during the first term of President Barack Obama. We got a bunch of other dollars also to match those dollars as well. You should know there were 4 nonprofit organizations and 3 universities that came together. So there was a very comprehensive, extremely robust partnership, key, I think, to doing PAR and or doing work meaningfully in the community, right? So all hands on deck, everyone played a significant role in making this happen. Project, we were charged with the task of examining physical violence, right? And the project actually took place in the Eastside and Southbridge sections or neighborhoods of the city of Wilmington. Keep in mind, Wilmington, 71,000 folk, has one of the highest homicide per capita rates in the country. I've been doing this work for some time as a street ethnographer in a number of cities and or communities and neighborhoods, going down from New York State, definitely New York City, all the way down here to Delaware. And I can honestly say there hasn't been one community where I have seen or known or met more people one day, and the next day someone was harmed or even killed, right? So, you know, so there's something very real about a homicide per capita rate. Right, so 29 homicides is the record. We were out there collecting data during that time, particularly during the summer of 2010. So it's real, and in terms of how we saw it and experienced it. Keep in mind, Wilmington's homicide per capita rate, definitely at the time of the study, higher than most big cities, places like New York, Philly, Baltimore, Chicago, LA as well. So it's happening here at a faster rate. So what is PAR? Just to talk a little bit more specifically about it. All right, so participatory action research. The term action research was actually coined by a social psychologist in 1946, Kurt Lewin. For what it's worth, I'm 4th generation. Kurt Lewin, you have Kurt Lewin, he has a student called Morton Deutsch. Morton Deutsch then has a student by the name of Michelle Fine, who really, really famous in the country for doing PAR. That's who I trained under to learn about PAR methodology, and I'm her student. PAR is mostly done, if I may add really quickly, in terms of academics. It's mostly done in public health, right? And it's mostly done also in education. I would say public health, definitely there in that field, you will see probably the most, pound for pound, evidence-based, empirically documented, methodologically sound forms or versions of PAR. So that's and there's a lot of grant money too, federal level and below. That's really streamlining a lot of the work. It's often referred to as community-based participatory research. PAR goes by many names, but that's pretty much where you can find it. But that's who's doing it. They were doing it back then as well. They were also doing it before PAR, before the formal language even evolved. So street outreach, PAR-esque kinds of methodology. So there is a long, strong tradition in that field. But PAR is when you include members of the population that you want to study on the actual research team, right? And you include them in every phase of the research project or process, theory, design, analysis, right? They should be also included on manuscripts as co-authors. Be encouraged to even author of their own, first author of their own manuscripts, because therein lies the power, right? This is about research for power. It's about empowerment. It can't simply be about organizing folk from the community to help you collect data. That's fine to some extent, right? But we have to be transparent and honest about all of that and what we also are getting out of it, monetarily and also the non-monetary incentives. Right? So that's day one of my orientations with the PAR teams that I've worked with across the years. Right? In addition to this being a research experience, it also should be an action experiences on 2 levels. First level should be for the actual PAR members. Right? So again, what are they actually getting out of it? For me, it is a prevention and an intervention program, not only for the PAR members, but also for the local community. Right? So at the end of this is a real experience, and they must be transitioned, right, in terms of the perspective that we take, they must be transitioned into quality opportunity. Jobs and schooling opportunities, right? And our standard was $15 to $20 hour jobs, It isn't, for me, a whole lot of money, but it's, it's decent money, particularly for those neighborhoods, right? So it has to be more about the research experience, and it has to be more about simply just doing action in the community, but the PAR members themselves need to get something out of it. Also, while they're on the actual research team, they need to be monetarily compensated as well, just like doctoral students. This is the doctoral student model that we're bringing to the street corner, right, as a way to help and transition them into upward mobility. So let me just say really quickly before I move on to the next slide, the theme of today and or the work, right, structural inequality, structural violence, economic opportunity. That's much of the violence and or the homicides and or many issues, substance abuse, STIs, you name it, are born out of profound structural violence. That's why it's happening. Okay, cool. Street PAR. I do a particular iteration of PAR called Street PAR. There are many iterations of PAR, right? So I'm squarely dedicated, committed to working with street identified, right? Their language, phenomenological language, colloquial language, right? Our researchers keep their perspective, but I'm solely committed. Not necessarily. So I've done other PAR projects, but Street PAR is committed to organizing those who are street identified and or active. Right, formally or active or formally involved with the streets, as well as those who may have been involved in criminal justice. Particularly when I worked with the Hope Commission, who was the lead organization on this project, they saw Street PAR as a type of re-entry program. And so Mayor Baker, who creates the Hope Commission, Charles Madden, executive director, all of them began to see this as a way to get them back on their feet. The way we began, always with a training, there was a 2-month training around research methods. There was a 3rd month as well, but that was more like a refresher month in January of 2010. The training actually began in November of 2009, 18 research methods workshops, 3 to 4 times per week, 3 to 5 hours per session. We do not water down the methodological training. You can't help them that way. It is tailored, right? In terms of the curricula, it is tailored. The readings, right? And we're reading on theory, methods, data analysis, quantitative and qualitative, looking at psychometric stuff. We're definitely doing some training around activism as well. Right? There were 3 doctoral students that were involved with this research project. Everyone's in the training taking notes, right? Because it has to be serious, but it has to be taught to them in a way in which they can receive it as well. And so I often say to my students, University of Delaware, right? If you're working really hard and you're not getting it, particularly like in my methods class or something like that, then that's my fault. Right? So we've kind of taken it for granted in the academy, right? If the student doesn't do well, whatever the reason is, it's the student's fault. Right? And that can be the case, but that's not oftentimes always the case, particularly in like analysis, data analysis class and methodology classes. Oftentimes that, I would argue, not taught well enough. Why the students aren't getting it in college or in high school or whenever. So you do have to work hard at tailoring the training for the population. We do not water it down because they have to walk away with the skill. This is the theories that are guiding the project. Sites Resilience have been working on this for years. We make the argument, put simply, that a street identity is a site of resilience. Most of my work is centered in the resiliency literature, right? It's a big literature in psychology. As you might imagine, like other forms of inquiry or analysis, these studies on forming rules, policies, laws, legislation, you name it. Right? So black men, black boys, particularly if they're low income, right? They are anything but resilient in that literature. And they're measuring it in all kinds of ways: employment, educational status, outcomes. Marriageability rates is a good way that they look at it. Read the work of William Julius Wilson, looking at it from that perspective. So forth and so. If you're in prison, you're not resilient. If you're on drugs, you're not resilient, right? So they're not resilient, right? And that's a problematic analysis. So basically, the resiliency literature makes the argument of who's in and who's out. And a number of us in that literature who are beginning to really confront that argument, in a way, that we think is more meaningful. Particularly if you read the work of Ed Gordon, particularly out of Columbia Teachers College, his son as well. He looks at resiliency of black boys and other populations in schools. right? And he would make the argument that, this simply sets up a dynamic where, you have some students who are in or who are out. When we look at our economic system, the capitalist system, Gordon argues that we must look at the intersection of capitalism and resiliency. Beautiful language. He unpacks that. And so what does that actually mean? Well, don't mean to convert anyone into what I'm about to say, but I do want to share with you a perspective, and a perspective that's helped these communities. We live in a structural system that does require inequality. Right? It requires unemployment. Our economic system requires bad schools or healthcare opportunities. Not maybe for most of Middle America, and most of Middle America can do and will be whatever it is that they want to aspire to. That's true. I do believe that, but not for them. Most of them will not make it out of this dynamic at all. Some will, at best. And I'm speaking statistically, and not off the hip. Right? So, as I often share with my students, right, we need these populations situated, immersed in this opportunity so that you and I, me included, can enjoy our privilege. That is the way that it's working. Right? So a site of resilience, right? We see crime as coping. We see crime as adaptive, right? And this is also an argument you can find in the literature, and we support it empirically as well, right? It's not that it's right. No one's saying that it's right. And I've never met a crack cocaine dealer that thought selling crack was a good thing. The mind is multidimensional and very dynamic. It is both and. I've never met someone that has harmed or hurt or killed someone that thought doing that in and of itself was a good thing. But it is adaptive, particularly if you grow up in or from intergenerational notions of extreme economic poverty. Right from there, going to jail, getting harmed in the streets, and or risking their lives, at the end of the day is worth it. What do they have to lose? We take their perspective seriously. That's what they're sharing with us. This is what the site's resiliency theory argues. Galtung argues that structural violence, right, is when individuals, neighborhoods, groups, right, or communities are sustained in economic poverty as a function of structural inequality. That's structural violence. And for us, no doubt, we looked at physical violence, but the team, the group, the PAR family, at the end of the day, if we're going to look at, we looked at physical violence, but we're going to look at physical violence, we had to look at it as a function of structural violence. They didn't have that language, but, I'm moving in the literature, and I help to pair, different ideas from the literature with what they were actually saying to me. Then we would read this stuff together in our message. This is the theory that I'm testing, very comprehensive notions of resilience. No time to really get into it today. However, if you're interested, you can check it out. These are the questions we'll deal with today. To what extent does economic well-being, to what extent is it predictive, experiences with violence, and a sample of street-identified black men and women between the ages of 18 to 35, and to what extent is economic well-being, the relationship between economic well-being and physical violence mediated by psychological and social well-being. All right, these are just some photos of us. At the top of the project, the News Journal, they've been, giving us a lot of coverage and press throughout the years. And we had the fortunate opportunity to have a 5-day front page series on the project, which was cool, 2010. And so on one day we were collecting data, and one of the photographers were out with us. All right, so we collected data, again, from the Eastside and Southbridge neighborhoods. This is a pilot study, right? We were planning actually on doing a larger, more citywide study to really test these ideas more aggressively. Mostly street-identified black sample between the ages of 18 to 35. This is a quota sample. We don't do random sampling in the neighborhoods, not with the street population, right? It's unethical. We'll talk more about that maybe in the Q&A. But I want to say this really quickly, right? So they help construct a quota sample based on census data, because it's about skill development, right? And I was the only person. There was a data analysis team that put this together. We separate the 15 into small subcommittees, sub-teams. Right? And in that team, I was the only individual to get 2 of the cells wrong. It's moving too fast for calculations. And they reminded me of that, right? And I was happy. I was like, wow, they all got it right. And I'm only sharing that because it reveals what we can do with them. Are bright. I often say, send me your worst, right? That's in quotes. Send me whatever person or individual that you think, right, is a throwaway, you know, particularly from a population like this. I'll send you back to kings and queens that they already were. They need opportunity to facilitate, you know, their aspirations and the good that we all want to see them do. $5. So we went to the community, 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. at night. We went to a number of hot sites or areas where there are a number of criminal activity taking place. Right, we went to also cool sites and more warm sites as well. Right, $5 in cash for a survey, and also $10 for an interview, and that is a whole lot of money. They also received information related to counseling, employment, and educational opportunities, like in a small packet. 18-page survey, which was co-designed by the research team as well. All right, let's jump into the data. 60% women, 40% men. These age groupings are actually based off just the way the census organizes its age groupings, so we just follow the same. You might imagine most sample between the ages of 22 and 29. Right, Leandre, urban fiction scholar, as I call him. He's from the community, you know, spent some time in prison. Very rhythmic speaker, very prolific writer, particularly about those urban fiction tales. Very popular in the city of Wilmington. And I ask all folk that I do research with, so why do black men go to the streets? Why? That's what Leandre had to say. Finance and wanting better things for yourself. We act like we don't see it, but boarded houses paint our neighborhoods. Potholes paint our neighborhoods. That's the stuff that keeps us stuck. I got to go home and 4 houses on my road is boarded. That's like an eyesore to me. Now I'm looking for a release valve, any release valve. And guess what that release valve is? There's a liquor store on every corner in the hood. He's boarded up houses and these potholes, and there's a boot on every car, and this is what I'm seeing. Damn, Mom, because Dad ain't around, because he's down P.O. Box 9561 or 1181 Paddock Road doing who knows how much time, right? So he says, Mom, is this all that we have, you know? Damn. The stories that we are hearing, right? And he's rhythmic and he's speaking, and I didn't even realize this. I thought these were just, you know, addresses that he just came up in the top of his head, and I found out later, or shortly after, these are the addresses to Howard Young Correctional Facility and Smyrna. But those addresses are stapled into his consciousness. Two-thirds of our population live in what we call low-income housing, particularly when you include multifamily homes in that number. 58% of the sample lives with children, right? We think that's really important. The implications of that are enormous, given that this is a mostly street-identified sample, right? When we asked Rennie Rocks about the living conditions, very famous videographer, spent some time in prison, in the streets, etc. And he says related to living conditions, which plays a role in why one goes to the streets as well. Look at how they are living, right? He says, man, wasn't nothing new in the home. Books holding up, couches, might not have a bed frame, your mattress and your box springs on the floor. Microphone is on. Your mattress and your box springs on the floor, the typical poverty Wilmington situation. But I never take nothing away from my mother. She tried everything she could to make sure that we had a hot meal every night, even if it was just breakfast food. We're going to make some French toast or something tonight. I love my mom to death. She's an inspiration for me. Look at educational status and also economic or employment status as well. But as we can see here, about 44% of the sample dropped out of high school. 41% dropped out during high school. Right? When we looked at this number, we thought it was very interesting because we asked them about their parents' educational status or level in regard to their father. This really jumped out. So most argued, right? What did they say? They said, well, like, keep in mind, 40% of the sample did not know or argued, excuse me, that their father did not have a high school diploma. 40%. And about 20% says they didn't know, more than likely because either for whatever the reason was, they didn't actually have a physical relationship with their father. 60%, right, either said no, they didn't have a diploma, or they didn't know at all. About two-thirds of the sample, right, were unemployed, most of whom who were actively looking for work, right? Keep in mind, so, we're pulling our hair out over, at least at one point, 7-8% unemployment rate, right? I think it's down, giving the line around 5.8% or something like that, right? That is laughable. Whatever we're pulling our hair out over, that is laughable to these neighborhoods. On average, you're looking at about a 50 to 70% unemployment rate in low-income Black and brown communities across the country, right? And oftentimes their dropout rates parallel those same numbers. So you're looking at about a 50 to 70% dropout rate. In some neighborhoods, it's higher than that. Talking about. When we look at the men and women, we see that nearly 70%, 70% of the men were unemployed in that age group in these two neighborhoods, and about 62% of the women, most of whom are actively looking for work. Right? So I took this, this is a quota sample we can generalize to some extent, right? And so I took the data to the community, to the neighborhoods, to professionals. I said, I need to know, because this is crazy. So I said, does this make sense? Does it feel like nearly 70% of the men, at least between this age range and in these neighborhoods, are walking around without any work? I couldn't find one naysayer, in or out of the neighborhood. Right, so it really begins to craft out, offer a context or a landscape to more deeply understand what is going on in these neighborhoods and or why they are doing what they're doing as it relates to crime. For our purposes, violence. And not begin to have a discussion how to reduce this issue of violence without talking about opportunities. Economic well-being. In this particular scale, higher scores are more negative. As we can see, men are slightly more negative with respect to their attitudes towards women. It's significant, but I think what's most important is their scores around negative well-being are actually not that far apart. Right? So women going through it too. Richard, when I asked him, I said, okay, I met him actually at his friend's funeral. Xavier Golden, I believe is his last name. Right? And his friend was killed, I believe, when he was 16 in Southbridge, shot and killed. Right? His mother gave me permission. His mother also was featured in the documentary. His mother gave us permission to film the funeral, the repast, viewing. And Richard met me at the repast, right? And he sat down with his family, He said to me, very suspicious of who I was, knew I was a researcher or he heard about it somehow. And, and as he should, very critical. Most of us, keep in mind, I think the practice of doing research is inherently exploitive practice. I say it to all my PAR members too, day one. This is inherently exploitive. And he was suspicious of that. Why am I there? To take advantage of them. And I affirmed his suspicions, and what I often say, yes, it is. I am also engaging in this exploitive enterprise. I believe, I hope, I pray I will do the most healthiest version of it. Definitely with my PAR members, we sit down and we talk about what they can get out of it on day one as well. Right? So that's the way I try and troubleshoot it. But it's a sticky web that we're all in for those of us who do this work. Hard not to. I just think it's important for scholars to kind of bring more attention to it. But he says in regard to employment, right, and him looking for work in Southbridge, two people who got computers in their crib or home, right, that actually have working internet. It's hard to look for a job where you ain't got no money. You got to get on a bus. You got to go here and there to fill out applications. You got to leave Southbridge. When I lived in Southbridge, I never left Southbridge. Southbridge, as many of us know, is the most isolated section of the city. The idea that they can just jump on a bus. A lot of times, $10, $15, $20 a day is a lot of money to them, including the drug dealer. right? So they're not going to walk to downtown Wilmington. And right, and the idea that most people don't have, the internet. Oh my, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have internet. We think exposure to physical violence is probably the most important finding, more important than actual experiences with physical violence. That's really what these communities and the sample is actually struggling with. About 55% have had a relative killed with a gun. No age group differences, no gender differences, no age group or gender interactions. They're all pretty much experiencing this, the data would suggest, at about the same rate. Have you had a friend killed with a gun? Well, about 60% says yes. Right? So how old were you when you first had a friend killed with a gun? Right? So on average, you're looking at about 18 years of age. We often say to folk, that's the time, shortly before, definitely during, where we need to be working with youth, because that's really the issue that they're struggling with. Let's talk about the violence. How much of it are we actually experiencing? Keep in mind, we didn't ask anyone. I also think that it's unethical to do so. We didn't ask anyone how much violence they committed. We left, and so they investigated the surveys. And they took a lot of items out, the part family. So how many times have you been chased by gangs or individuals? About 80% in this sample. These are the crack cocaine dealers. Right? So the idea that it's violence abound, that everyone's running around getting beat up and all, man, no. Most people in the streets are not violent as a form of identity. Doesn't mean they haven't done a couple of things along the way. But as a form of identity, most people are not actually violent. It is not a Wild Wild West scenario that's going on in Wilmington. If that was the case, the military would descend yesterday, right? Not to say that there isn't an issue, but it's important for us to put it in perspective if we want to effectively help. Right? About 9% argue that it happened more than 12 times. Chief of Police, when we gave them a presentation of the data, made the argument that this looks accurate because they're not seeing a whole bunch of people come in to WPD, right? They're seeing the same folk coming in, cycling in and cycling out. This is consistent with national data as well. How many times have you been slapped, punched, or hit by someone? About 55% says it happened at least once. How many times have you actually been attacked or stabbed with a knife? Only about 75% said it's never happened. Again, these are the crack cocaine dealers. Right? About 8% though said that's happened numerous times. How many times have you actually been shot with a gun? About 80% says that's never happened. And keep in mind, right? Most if you read the work of Victor Rios, his book called Punished, looking at Black and Latino adolescents in Oakland, right, around with regard to police, their interactions, also looking at violence. And one of the things that he found in his time out there was that most of the time that a person spends in the street, the vast majority of their time, is a non-violent kind of media representations and kind of tugs on the worst parts of our imagination. Silver lining in the study. Most folk would argue, right, literature, scholars included, right, that these men don't love themselves, love their families, don't love their children. It's a popular one. Right, they don't love their communities. Black self-hatred argument has a fine tradition in the psychology literature. We've been arguing that black children and black people hate themselves since 1954, and prior to that as well. But it's in 1954 that Brown versus Board gets settled, and it was ultimately settled on this argument. Settled on other arguments as well, but this was key and core to the argument. Thurgood Marshall, Lewis Redding, interestingly enough, would make the argument by bringing in folk like Mammoth and Kenneth Clark, doll studies. These children, most of them were very young children they looked at in this study. They generalized that data to adults, though, or older children at the very least. But they made the argument that these children hate themselves. That was the language back then, black self-hatred. Now we call it internalized oppression or internalized racism. Right? Because they picked the white doll. The data was reanalyzed. I encourage you to look at the work of Bill Cross or William E. Cross Jr., Shades of Black, 1991, Temple publication. It was analyzed, reanalyzed, and guess what? Black children mostly actually picked the black doll. Even if they did mostly pick the white dollar, it's just bad science. Just like saying if you straighten your hair or, do something else, wear a suit, you hate yourself. That's what it's likened to. And I think, keep in mind, in all fairness, they actually just wanted poor black children to get more quality educational opportunity. So they did or said what they thought they needed to, right, for their greater good. Neighborhoods like Wilmington have been reeling. A lot of low-income black communities do not like Brown versus Board. It's a middle American idea. Right, keep in mind the idea, what they ultimately argued was, let's move the children, let's integrate them, because more upwardly mobile white children will demonstrate, model for poor black children, I guess through social osmosis, how to love themselves. I guess it's 1954, so we do have to understand it within the time. So what do we find? Most scholars who are still studying this are looking at black populations, but they aren't looking at identified populations. Most black scholars, while they would argue now, other scholars too, black self-hatred, that's a defeated idea at this point. Most black people don't suffer from it. People would agree to that, but they would say probably the guys in the streets of the criminal justice system are struggling with it. How could you sell crack cocaine in the community if you love the community? How could you kill someone if you have high self-esteem? So what do we find? We found about 83% of our sample were very satisfied with their life. These are the crack cocaine dealers. We found about 85% of the sample were happy with themselves or very happy. We found that about 94% of the sample found themselves to be useful. With regard to the community, we found that about 76% of the sample thought they agreed or strongly agreed with the item, I feel a responsibility to make my community better. Right? This is our social cohesion scale, which demonstrated they were moderately positive on the scale with regard to social cohesion. Right? And we began to look at their language, particularly through the qualitative analysis, right? And their language, right? Street love. What does that mean? That means when guys in the street give back to the community in positive ways. And I've been finding this in all of the communities that I've been doing work out of. Some scholars reached out to me from the University of West Indies and Jamaica. They began to see this after reading some of my published work around this. They see the same thing happening with the Dons, right, of Kingston. In fact, when you lock them up, as Wilmington Police also said to me, when you lock some of these guys up, guess what? Because keep in mind, right, they're paying rent, buying the book bags, right, actually resolving a lot of disputes in the community, right? They're feeding, they're doing a whole bunch of things, right? And like the scholars in Jamaica were saying, right, when and the police were saying in Wilmington, right, when some of these guys get locked up, ironically enough, violence goes up. Right? In the case of Jamaica, domestic violence goes up, substance abuse goes up. So I'm not calling for more guys to engage in crime to do this. They're not calling for that. But at the end of the day, one thing that we can begin to at least this suggest, right, begin to acknowledge is in many respects they are outpacing the community professionals in terms of giving back. In terms of those of us who are actually paid to do this. The community actually trusts them. Right? This kind of ironic, in this kind of ironic way. So what does Banks say? Quite a few guys I know from my side of town that gave back 4th of July, fireworks, barbecue, DJs down at the park, big barbecues, made sure their hood, right, was okay, provided for. You have some guys in the street that actually give back to the community in a good way, even though they're doing what they do. All right, so we found economic well-being to be predictive of experiences with physical violence and negative so negative economic well-being. So economic well-being, particularly if it increased brought down experiences with violence. We found that economic well-being was also predictive of social cohesion as became more positive. Economic well-being became more positive. Social cohesion increased as economic well-being also became more positive. We found that psychological well-being increased. We found that as psychological well-being increased, it predicted an inverse relationship, but it predicted, right, a decline and decrease in experiences with violence. As social cohesions increased, experiences with physical violence also came down. Wow. Look at that model. We do need to test this more aggressively. This is a pilot study. We do intend on organizing more of a citywide study and really looking at this more deeply. But what does this at the end of the day suggest at best, these models? Well, it suggests that social cohesion and their psychological well-being scores, which helps to explain relationships between economic well-being and experiences of violence, in some respects are offsetting, containing, controlling violence. That if their scores and activities were not as high or as positive as they were, more than likely, violence would be worse. This is the crack cocaine population, so we have to think about it within that context. And I wouldn't even be able to think about it in this way. Economic well-being and physical violence mediated by psychological and social well-being, if it wasn't for the project taking their perspective so seriously. How do you think about something like this? Right? Trust me, they're not talking about this in literature. Definitely not talking about them having high psychological and social. What about those PAR members? Keep in mind, employment is important. What they want. Most of the guys on the project are about a little over a year out of prison before they join the Street PAR project. Right? 12 Street PAR family members are presently employed, $15 to $20 hour jobs. In most instances, let me say that is our standard. Keep in mind, they all receive some form of quality opportunity meeting that standard, though. Right? So, for instance, Center for Drug and Alcohol Studies, now renamed Center for Health. Drug and Health Studies. There you go. They changed their name. Hired all 15 members, paid them $17 an hour, and collect data for them. A number of research ERS and or research projects, particularly with the big federal grants, R1 grants, began hiring the PAR members as well. They were well trained. They will go into those dicey places, bring you back the data just as you want it. And I told them that I'm not saying don't hire the doctoral students. I'm just saying this will also save you maybe more bang for the buck. They will go to those places that the doctoral students aren't going to get you that nice, juicy, sensational data that we all want. They began hiring them, and the news journals began covering that part of the story. 6 Street PAR members enrolled in college. One has graduated from college or with his undergraduate degree. 2 is enrolled in graduate school. Those same 2 completed their Masters of Arts degrees, and those same 2 are now working on their doctorates. Keep in mind, I'm not saying this for sensational reasons. I'm saying it because I want us to recognize the possibilities. Keep in mind, my PAR members have done anything that you can imagine, right? With the exception of sexual assault. They weren't locked up for that. Right? And look at what we can do with them. We want to. We've at this point made well over 100 presentations. I just stopped counting it in this way. At this point, probably in the ballpark of about 150. Right? And I tell them, just like I tell graduate students, make sure you put all of the talks where appropriate, put all those talks on your CV. We work closely with your CV to get them ready. Action is very important. So let me just close up by talking about the kinds of action that we've done. So we've had a documentary that's caught a lot of attention called The People's Report. It can be found on peoplesreport.com. And we are selling it. All the dollars actually go to our research fund that we have established for the next research project. Right? So about 500-600 people came out, the governor's office, mayor's office, city council, a number of students, obviously people from the community. We had movie night, popcorn and everything. So, this is us on the panel. Street art, another way. I do oftentimes engage in the arts as a form of activism. We've done 2 street art exhibitions in Wilmington. The first was at Christina Cultural Arts Center, and it was standing room only. We also released our mixtape called The People's Report, right? And that night at Christina, the News Journal was there, covered it as well. On the mix CD, which is on the website as well. Hip-hop artists, poets, singers, all music for justice. This is at the Delaware Center for Contemporary Arts, Wilmington Trap Stars. Street art exhibition, 50 local artists, approximately 276 pieces of art, all around the relationship between structural inequality and violence. We also also organized 25 performers for a 2-day showcase, ACCEL as well, from that mixtape and other artists as well. Well attended. I think about 300-400 people can actually fit in the space. The first night we had a little over 1,000. The next day we had about 400 people that came through. The community showed up. Another way we did action, the top of the year, first week in January, Drew Fennell reached out to me, Governor's Chief of Staff, given all the stuff that's going on with police and black men in the country then and now. Right? And we need to get out in the community, and we need to meet folk, and we took them to the hot spots where a lot of the homicides took place, so those neighborhoods. Organized a little mini tour in the community. And everywhere we went, standing room only. And they were deep, honest, open, and rich conversations between the governor and Mayor Williams. Crime Commission, a group just released their findings the other night. I believe their report is now available online. This is a big deal in Delaware, as I'm sure we all know. So nine persons, I believe, were selected. And the only person from the University of Delaware that was selected to sit on this crime commission, which mostly focused on policing, was Darrell Ching, one of our partners, senior research associate, who's working on his doctorate and his PhD in sociology. His master's thesis actually was on the policing data from the People's Report. So he was, yes, we have the most relevant data from the perspective of the people about interactions, attitudes with, and experiences with the police. So he was perfect for this commission. More pictures from the neighborhood. I didn't know what he was going to show me. He was pulling his pants down. But what he wanted to show me was that he was shot September 4th, 2009, a few blocks away. He was just showing me his gunshot wounds. My Keisha, she's showing us her stab wounds, scar tissue. Jonathon Wilson, he's one of the gentlemen working on his doctorate now at Wilmington University. He's working with EDD specifically. Keep in mind, right, he opened up during and after the project on hair salon in Southbridge. He organized GED and youth mentoring programs out of there. He would bring in professors and talk with the youth. We found 100% of black boys in this neighborhood. Nobody losing it. That's including black people. Right? 100% of them. Years on end. We spoke to the news journal. We got to do something about this. They didn't believe us. No one believed us. It's true. They eventually found that it was true, and then they published their story. That's why he's doing GED. Anytime you see large numbers of any population doing any one thing, stat 101, that is structural. There is no way that any population, 100% of any population, would ever do any one thing. I've met with Mark Murphy. I've met with a number of governor's cabinet and without to talk about this. They agree. The dropout rate, as I expressed to them, can mostly be explained by the schools themselves. They're removing the children, then calling them dropouts. By and large, the idea that a young man is sitting home smoking marijuana, I don't want to go to school, again, tugs on the worst parts of our imagination. It's not true. This is a national trend. This is not unique to Delaware. But they're not resistant to that idea. They are aware of what's going on. In all fairness, they're doing it because maybe the kid has an academic problem or a behavioral problem, maybe he's 17 in 9th grade. Sometimes they lie to the kid and say, well, you've aged out. Every state has their own age, right? But it's usually around 22, 21, 22. You can be in 17th grade in 9th or 8th grade. That is legal. But instead, they'll say you've aged out, or you should go to night school, or you should do this. And they lose them. Ashley, doing very well. Paid intern now at Barclays. She will be an engineer in another year or two, or something like that, year and a half. But doing very well. Extraordinary story, too. Pat wrote 2 books, now is on his 3rd. Prolific author, right? He also was selected to be the director of the Street Outreach program that Mayor Williams signed. So Cease Violence Wilmington is one of our 17 recommendations. Street Outreach. Street Outreach is known to bring down physical violence, empirically. Right? And so, you know, and there are other part members on the team as well, on the Street Outreach team. And they go out, particularly when there's physical violence or homicide, meet with the families, meet them in the hospital, that kind of thing. is Darrell Chambers. Right, worked with a number of other university professors as well. You can check us out. Another way we're doing action. peoplesreport.com. So we do have a web presence. Very interactive website. I encourage you all to check it out. We have also made 17 recommendations across these 4 target areas, and we've gotten civic and political leadership to really help us out with a number of the recommendations. At the end of the day, we call for interventions to be situated within the context of personal and communal empowerment. It's just important that we underscore that a context for empowerment must be provided, that empowerment actually becomes possible. The idea of this, pick yourself up by the bootstraps, no one's doing that. Doesn't mean that we aren't working hard. No one's doing whatever we're doing by ourselves. However, in many instances, the assumptions and the interventions and the messaging that we send them is you got to do it by yourself. The only way you're going to get there. And so we don't actually offer it's a both and argument. It's about working on yourself. But it's also about dealing with those structural impediments as well. They want to work or be employed. They want to go to school, including college. The data supports that, hours and otherwise, and they want to give back to their local neighborhoods. So it's time for us to meet them where they are actually at, so that we can all facilitate the change in and out of them that we all want to see. We just quickly say, social media, the community let me know, because I wasn't thinking social media. This is the way we got to go, Yasser, that's what they said. And I said, wow. So I know we have upwards of, 20,000 followers on Twitter. Everyone's following. Civic and political leadership, definitely the governor's office, mayor's office, number of celebrities enough for following us. Wow. And I encourage you all to check it out. All right. Thank you.
I have a question. You mentioned really briefly.
Hi, this is Wilmington. We have a question.
Oh, you want to go there first?
Wilmington, you want to ask a question?
Let's see
Never mind.
Go ahead.
So yes, you mentioned really briefly that you thought the random sample would be unethical, and that I didn't understand that.
Let's go. That's Mr. Chambers, who I've been talking about all day. Definitely. Random sampling, right, which is, most rigorous form of sampling, experimental models as well. Yeah, I've done quasi-experimental models in these communities, or quasi-experimental work. We're intending on doing another big one in Wilmington so we can get this money. So we do quota sampling. To randomly sample would mean we have to do something like, along the lines of 1 drug dealer, 2 drug dealer, 3, right, we'll take the 4th. So we don't actually out anyone when we go to these communities. I don't ask anyone like, would you say you are sure, or do you sell drugs? We wouldn't do something like that. So what we end up doing is just going to the environments, where so we'll go to where they're selling crack cocaine, right? Or one of my partner members took me to where they were selling a lot of heroin at one day, and I was like, man, we were in this park and so many people, right? And it was so open, right? So we go to those environments. And they know, what we're looking for and what we don't. But we don't actually have that explicit conversation because it would be difficult to get them as a participant.
When you say quota samples, what does it mean? Quota based on what?
It's based on census data, so we have to have the same. So we have to have this.
Demographics.
Yeah, we have to have the same proportion. So keep in mind, we collected probably about 1/3 of the available data, something along the lines of 1,500 or so, a little over 1,500 people. According to the Census 2000, in the Eastside and Southbridge neighborhoods between the ages of 18 and 35 who are Black American. So I think for the first cell, Black boys between the ages of 18 and 21, according to those, to the census data, they represented approximately 13% of everyone in that age grouping or demographic. Right? So that just simply means our cell, 18-21, has to be 13% of folk of Black boys or black males between the ages of 18 to 35 from those 2 neighborhoods. Your data just has to be proportionate. It's just you know, the second best way that you can do it. But we don't ask anyone, are you street? Do you engage in crime? No, that would be. Yes, sir.
So, well, thank you. I mean, I'm completely overwhelmed. If I was to take sort of a big picture of what you've shown us, willing good people, structural problems. My take. And yet,
yeah.
Is that fair?
Yes. When you say willing good people, who are you referring to?
The people you're talking about in the community.
Yes.
Willing good people.
Yes.
Deep structural problems.
Yes.
And yet, what I think our path in our society is going the opposite way. Well, individual responsibility. You have to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. So you know, we have to. Seems to me what we need to do is establish this message, and then figure out as a society what we're gonna do about it. So, what do you think? Where do we begin? I mean, we've been studying it forever, but we're already getting there. It's studying it, aren't we? I've heard that from you too. We got to start studying it. We got to start doing stuff.
No, I think we still need to study it. Right? I think I often say to local communities, primary data is probably one of the most important tools for war. You know, in terms of not physical war, in terms of dealing and debating and engaging in discourse, getting your own data. I think archival data is good too, but more effective is your own data because you're going to collect it and analyze it in a particular way. Structural inequality, right? It's the heartbeat of America. Keep that in mind. It's a problem because, right, and this is a new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argument. This is her argument. She also met the PAR team, had the opportunity to have lunch with her when she came to the University of Delaware as well. She supports the project. But this is her argument, right? Her language, a slave caste is required. Keep that in mind. If it were not organized in that way, meaning a slave caste, poor population, she looked at different slave castes, those who were enslaved, and she looked at folk who were caught up in the convict lease system in her work, and then she transitioned to the traditional Jim Crow system, right? And then she transitions to the new slave caste, which is the criminal justice system. She says they all will grow out of popularity at some point, right? But what we have to do as an economic system, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You have to find a way to transition to, right, a new slave caste system. Somebody has to be at the bottom. Somebody has to pick up the garbage. Somebody has to do without. So what is the purpose of poor people? I say this to my students all the time. Economically speaking, well, the purpose of them is to stabilize the currency. And with this new trade deal, the TPP, right, Trans-Pacific Partnership, economic and/or havoc, economic, that will wreak across and they're pushing that through, right? Up and down vote, Swift is just, we're not even debating it, right? So, or they're trying to. There is some opposition now in Congress, but not the kind of opposition that we need to see. So my point is, it's deeply structural, right? Leading economists would argue you need about 5% of the adult population to be unemployed. Right? Works out to be about 15 to 20 million people, about 1 in 5 children, or some would argue about 1 in 5 people in general are poor, right? And that's 20, but it's really more like 40 to 50 million people who are really in that. Where it's at. Our version of capitalism, it's a hoarding. So we hoard wealth here, concentrated, and so when you have that kind of economic dynamic occurring, right? So what do you do? Well, lots of folk have tried lots of things, right? So I gave a talk on MLK Day and I made the argument, MLK did not actually die for fighting against racism or race issues. They loved him, Middle America did. Poster child for him. He didn't have that kind of support in low-income Black America. No, not at all. Not by and large. But he died for fighting against capitalism. Because he began listening, like Ozzie Davis would say before he died. He woke up the last 2-3 years of his life, right? And he began listening to poor Black Americans. Right, and the men, right? And then he began now, in the last 2-3 years of his life, he began arguing, right? Our men need the opportunity to be men again through work. Look at the work, which I shared at the President's Cabinet meeting the other day, right? Look at the work of W.B. Du Bois. I'm a Du Boisian. Through all of his work, what's the common denominator is structural inequality, economic poverty, unemployment, and the criminal justice system. If you read his work, most people don't reference that from him. That is what he's mostly writing about. Right? He releases a big study called the Philadelphia Negro. late 1800s. Oh man, looking at North Delaware, he's looking at Philadelphia, lots of violence, lots of data on public health in the black community at that time, right? And he thousands of people he served. It's an enormous study, right? And the thing that he walks away with is jobs. Right? So we've been asking for jobs since we've been here. Right? So 80% of all black people were enslaved during the period of slavery. 80% of all black people were blue collar at best up until 1965. Right? So we just got a stable black middle class, 50 years old this year. Right? And most of us aren't making a whole lot of money either. Right? So the point of it that I'm trying to make is this. Structural inequality is required. It has been sustained since the commencement of the country. You hear things like politicians or someone like Barack Obama saying, my brother's keeper initiative, right, which made so many black people feel like, wow, okay, it's going to change, right? And it's just rhetorical. No real dollars running underneath that. There are no real economic opportunities. Not here. We'll send $1 billion or $2 or $3 elsewhere. Right? I'm not saying they shouldn't get help, whoever they are. But the idea you would send $1 billion or $2 to these communities, which are figuratively, these are third world living conditions. Like, oh my God. Right? But the purpose of poor people, it stabilizes our lifestyle. I give talks in prisons all the time. I was talking at Smyrna one time, right? Everybody was there, the commissioner, the warden, and everything, right? And at this point in the game, we have fed on and grown to be so dependent on the criminal justice system for so long. The idea that you can just disband it, right? It would actually throw our economy in a tizzy. You would have to, at best, phase it out. Too many people, too many of us are benefiting from it.
So, on that comment, on that theme, so we have the DOJ report in Ferguson, a government-sponsored report that demonstrated predatory government practices against the underserved, using that community as a way to support the larger community through predatory fining regimes that actually prevented them from going to work. So they had to take time off from work to deal with it, and a very aggressive policing force tied to a very aggressive court system, tied to a very aggressive tax regime. That's replicated throughout the entire.
Yes, sir.
And the thing that goes through my mind is you have ample evidence generated by the government itself, in addition to studies, but you see inaction. And you hear, and we're in election season, and you hear rhetoric that's extremely disturbing. It's a form of, it's very depressing.
Yeah. Malcolm X actually brought a lawsuit against the country before he was assassinated to deal with everything that you're just saying, right? Because it's actually illegal and unconstitutional to sustain any population in economic poverty. In terms of my conversations with civic and political leadership, and we take this same message wherever we go, from, in this case, the governor's office all the way down. They're actually more open to these conversations than most would think or imagine. They are in agreement that structural violence is at play. The data, anybody would be hard pressed to say no at this point. But what they say, which I think, is fair, at the end of the day, what do you want? What we probably can't do is topple capitalism by the end of the week. We didn't create the system. We agree that this is going on. I'm not asking for them to topple it either by the end of the week. Right now, we're just trying to bring attention to it, in ways, particularly to everyday folk that maybe not be thinking this deeply, right? Because it's easy to, again, subscribe to the worst parts of imagination about them. So we want to know why they're doing what they're doing. Look at some experimental studies. You'd be surprised what any individual would do in a year's time. Right? Look at some experimental work, right? Particularly if they take away your basic needs, right? In terms of what human nature would force any of us to do to survive. Wolfie sometimes tells me stories, him and Sean Allen, special assistant to the mayor, he gave me, he texted me a few months back, and they went into someone's home, just bringing them, some basic goods, deal with some things that they were struggling with on the inside. And I get a text from Wolfie, and he's saying, There had to be like 10 or 15 children in there in a 2-bedroom apartment. Not to mention the adults. Right? And they're walking out of there in tears. Right? Like, and so if you read a Newsweek article in particular, by Abigail Jones, and it's some of it is a little sensational murder, but if we just pay attention to the story, she's talking about this. She's talking about hanging out with Wolfie in the neighborhood and somebody walking up to Wolfie saying, "Can I get a couple $2 to eat?" This is America, right? So it's deeply structural. They have pegged Black America, or segments of it, as the out group. We need an out group. We're all playing a role in this too, me included. And so there's no innocent bystander here, right? What we would do too, if we made sure everyone had opportunity. Keep in mind, what are we doing? Totally undermining a capitalistic system. And then we're probably moving more into something like socialism, what some would think would be communism. That's why they are stopping. Even if you look at something like the New Deal, right? I teach this in my grad class, and we look at the New Deal. The New Deal, trust me, the folk who, everyone benefited from that except for poor Black people, right? Because you had a Democratic South that would not sign on to it if FDR supported that. They have always been the out group. And we have still blamed them when they inevitably would fall short. But my point in saying all of that is that's how complicated it becomes, even with the data. But I think we need to do at this point, something that we talk a lot about, Darryl and myself and others, is organizing a structural violence campaign, street outreach campaign, on the ground, really informing people who are going through this, arming them with, equipping them with a basic language. Because they know instinctually, emotionally what's going on, but they're caught up in the day-to-day, and they got to do this. They can't sit around and process this stuff in quite the same way that we can, even though they are aware that something is going on. Right? I think there needs to be a more concentrated protest against civic and political leadership about jobs and about structural opportunity. And so I think that's where we're at this point at best. So we're like, let's just bring as much attention to it as possible. Yes, sir.
So one of the things I've read about in some of this literature people talk about, I'm sure you've heard this one before, getting to Denmark. There's a society that's egalitarian. That
would be beautiful. Yes.
Everyone's egalitarian. Almost no poverty, lots of opportunity, no violence to speak of, despite a recent attack there.
Yes.
So if getting to Denmark, we're not going to be Denmark. We have much greater diversity, but if getting to Denmark and having an egalitarian society is possible, why do you say with capitalism we have to have an out group? Why can't we do better?
Somebody, again, leading economists would argue that you need poor people. Brian, you want to answer that, or?
Yes, sir. In the many of the wonderful conversations you and I have had over this very topic, in how it relates between education outcomes and health outcomes and the connections between the two. One thing that we keep coming back to is the sense that the institutions right now, the legacy institutions, including academia, including medicine, the ones that are probably at the apex of our capitalist system now in terms of privilege or being able to voice privilege, were also the very systems that were built on white supremacy. So we can't forget that, first and foremost. And second, the privilege that these institutions now hold and the folks that work within those institutions need to not be afraid to say these things and talk about the evidence and the data, and not just stop at the notion of inequalities or disparities, but delve into the realm of equity and inequities in the sense that there are structural issues that make it unfair for certain sectors of our society and makes it make the health achievements or the education achievements or whatever you want to call it unachievable. And until we address that clearly and honestly, and that the folks who have the privilege and recognize that privilege, first you have to recognize it, because I think a lot of people do not like to recognize their privilege in the society for fear that they need to do something about it, right? That's a huge issue, and I think not just medicine but also academia.
Yes, sir.
Folks now in corporate America, for instance, these are the places that need to be the other end of the sandwich, so to speak. If we have the outreach happening at the street level, and we have the folks who are actually living and benefiting from the privilege that they experience because of these inequalities, saying these things, that's what ultimately needs to happen.
I'm with you.
I know we're running over a little bit, but just to speak to on that issue, there's a book out called Medical Apartheid.
Yes.
You're familiar with that one, yeah? And written by a PhD candidate from Harvard, part of her dissertation, where she actually looked at American medicine going back to the times of slavery, and you find some extraordinarily disturbing facts. For instance, females, during the early stages of learning about obstetrics, you had women subjected to sometimes 40 surgeries in the absence of anesthesia. Slaves. We don't talk about that, but those were the animal subjects. Back in that time period, Johns Hopkins played a major role in that as well. In fact, the founder of the obstetrics department was the one doing those things at Johns Hopkins, actually, back in those days. And in the racial history of Hopkins in and of itself is pretty tough when you look at it. The first African American surgeon was 1973.
Well, the way the original building was built was on the traditional H model.
That's right.
And part of the irony of Johns Hopkins is it's probably one of the institutions, Syracuse, Johns Hopkins, in Michigan, maybe University of Delaware, but they're leading the way with regard to part research in the community of Baltimore.
That story.
That's true. Yeah.
And I give Hopkins credit on that one because they admitted they screwed that up.
Yeah.
And now have a totally dedicated process to that. But that story is, so there's some. It's tough. A lot of people aren't familiar with the African burial ground next to Wall Street. Why Wall Street is actually called Wall Street.
This is true.
Which is where our financial structures are put together. So it's a tough history. I think personally, it's similar to domestic violence, right? It's a terrible, uncomfortable conversation. But if you're going to get through it, you got to have it. And without a culture of blame mindset, you just say you're not accusing anyone in the room of doing the surgeries on women without anesthesia. But you're saying we must at least be honest enough to say it happened, and it needed to, and we need to be aware of it and accept it as fact. The Ferguson report, be aware of it, accept it as fact, and then build processes to decrease those inequities going forward. Didn't mean to get on my soapbox. But anyway, I don't know how much time we have. Are we out of time?
Cool. Thank you.